We all experience doubt in our lives. Doubt can show up in a number of different aspects of our lives, and wherever it does, doubt erodes feelings of surety and certainty that we have in life. We have all sorts of different areas where we're operating in our lives, and in those areas, we're generally operating with some sort of sense of, I know what's going on here. I have a certain sense of place and understanding. I know how to do certain things to produce certain outcomes. And doubt can come into any sort of range of experiences and begin to sort of pull the rug out from under any of those things. Research shows that the majority of people in America, of adults in America, struggle with self-doubt and sort of resulting and related low self-esteem. Some people suggest that as much as 85% of people, adults in the United States, struggle with self-doubt. We hide it very well. We're in a society where you have to hide it very well. Fake it till you make it, all that sort of stuff. But really underneath, we're like faking it even harder because we're struggling with a serious sort of self-doubt in some area of our lives. Even very successful people struggle with self-doubt. People that we look at and externally we go, there's absolutely no reason whatsoever. God bless that sound. Love it. I love all interruptions. I'm unfazable. All interruptions, noises, children, adults that are behaving like children. No, I'm just kidding. But I'm not. All interruptions. Love them all. Thank you. They're all part of what God is doing in this moment in time, right here, right now. It's not pre-programmed. It's not whatever. It's just what God's doing right now. And you just can't mess it up. You can't mess it up when you're doing what God's doing in any given moment. It's awesome. So love that. Thank you. I know it's brutal. It's just you're like, don't point any more attention. The mercy of the Lord. The mercy of the Lord. So even really successful people can... I want to keep joking about that. I'm going to stop. I'm going to turn the spotlight back over here. Even really successful people can feel like they struggle with self-doubt. In 2015, Venus Williams, like one of the most decorated, successful athletes of all time, certainly the most dominant player to ever play women's tennis, one of the most dominant tennis players of all time, one of the most dominant athletes of all time, said to a group of kids in 2015, self-doubt is real, everyone has it. Understanding that being nervous, having doubts, and lacking confidence are emotions that are human, and it's how you deal with it. It's okay. It is okay to feel that way. What if doubt and the eroding experiences that can come with doubt aren't just things that we sort of navigate in our personal lives? They're not just things that we navigate at times like in a communal setting, in a communal crisis. But what if the experience of doubt can get baked in to a time? It can get baked into an age, baked into a society, such that you could go into that society and begin experiencing doubt because that time is built to create that experience. Woof. Exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say. What is doubt? How do we deal with it? How do we deal with doubt when and if we live in a time where doubt is baked in? These are the questions that we're going to be asking today. We are in the middle of a sermon series titled, Why Does It Feel Like God Isn't Real? And in this sermon series, we are trying to examine the conditions of belief that have created the spiritual environment that we live in this time. We really don't understand faith. We don't understand our life of faith. We don't understand the challenges in faith that we encounter if we don't understand the time that we live in. It would be like trying to navigate the physical landscape that you live in without caring at all about the weather of the place that you live in. It wouldn't work. You wouldn't even think to do that. And yet we are in a time because our society is so in its own way kind of inarticulate about the forces that have led it to this place, the ideas that have led it to this place. We live in a very confused and confusing age and time, and so many people are just alive in this space, in this time, in a particular spiritual context, and experience certain spiritual things or faith things and don't really understand the landscape and the furniture of the place and the time that we're set in. And when that happens, we can misappropriate all sorts of things in our life of faith to other causes and explanations when sometimes we're just experiencing the things that we're experiencing because they're baked into this time. We have been walking through this, and the first 4 weeks, we're looking at ideas, certain ideas that are baked into this time that have led us to this place. We looked at the idea of secularity, the idea that conditions of belief can be such in a particular time that people are able to think of themselves as having a meaningful life without any transcendent reference. There's some sort of imminent reference, that we understand life as meaningful. We looked at the idea of disenchantment, the removal of the idea of God to explain hypotheses in the physical world. We looked at the idea of a crisis of meaning that our time is in. And then in the second half of the sermon series, which we are now very firmly in, next week is the last week, we've shifted from ideas that have led us to this time. There's tons of chairs. Come on in. I know you can't see them, but there's a bunch over here. There's a couple right here. We're so glad you're here, Sarah. Yeah, right there. There's a spot right there. Get in here. 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 Exactly, yeah. Now everyone else is like, he's pointed out 2 people. Sir, my goal is 10. Get ready. I'm just kidding. And now in the second half of the sermon series, we've shifted from ideas that led us to this place to experiences that characterize the space and time that we're in. And we have looked at, what have we looked at? Time, that we feel like we're running out of time. We always feel like we're running out of time, right? Exhaustion, rest, that we cannot rest, we're exhausted. Today we're looking at doubt. Next week we'll close by looking at loneliness. We're going to read today from the scripture, from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 to 10. I'm not going to have the text up on the screen, because we've got to learn how to be comfortable engaging with the Bible on our own. So open up a Bible. I see so many Bibles. Wow, yes. God bless you. And I love the personal Bibles. Like, I've had this Bible. It's beaten up. It's like, gosh, I love that. Thank you for bringing your Bibles. Open it up on a device, whatever. We've got the pew Bibles. You can keep those if you don't have a Bible. Again, we're in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 to 10. Hebrews is in the New Testament. It's immediately after Philemon. It's the first letter to show up after the letters of Paul. I thought Paul wrote Hebrews. Well, it's a question. We'll talk about that later. And by later, I mean not today. So be prepared to just sit with that question. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 to 10. I'll read the text aloud. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. By faith Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. By faith Enoch was taken up, so that he should not see death, and was not found, because God had taken him. Now before he was taken, he was commended at having pleased God. And without faith it is impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists, and that he rewards those who seek him. By faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has its foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Our world is full of doubt. We live in a world that is full of doubt. In some sense, the question of doubt is always on the table when we're talking about relationship with God and belief in God. In some sense, no matter where you live in this world, in this physical reality, any time, any culture, any geographical location, the question of doubt is on the table because God is unseen. God's unseen. We're talking about faith in a religious context. We're talking about faith in a reality that's unseen. And whenever we as physical creatures, who are often overwhelmed and bombarded by our physical empirical senses, what we can see, what we can touch, what we can taste, being bombarded by all the data that comes through those things, we find belief in the physical to be very natural. We're like, oh yes, of course, I can see that, I can taste that, I can touch that. But whenever we start talking about something that is unseen, something that we would use the language of the spiritual to describe, there's always going to be a challenge for us to believe in that reality, simply because we cannot engage with it empirically like we can with the physical world around us. In that space, the physical world feels super real, and spiritual reality feels, I don't know, like it might not be real. It might be a hoax, maybe. I don't know. Even in places and times when the idea that you should believe in God has been baked in, people still struggle with doubt in those times because of this basic situation that we're physical beings trying to engage with a spiritual reality. In the history of the life of God's people, Israel, their entire society in the Old Testament, from the Exodus through the destruction of Jerusalem, the exile, coming back to the Holy Land, rebuilding the temple, that whole story, 1,000-year story, is built around the idea that God exists and is present in the life of this nation. The idea that everyone should believe in God was baked into that society in that time, and yet it's the whole testimony of the Old Testament that people in those situations can still struggle with doubt. And this shows up all over the Old Testament. People will say, I believe in God, yes, we're worshiping God, we're doing all the right stuff, but when push comes to shove, and they need to find some solution to some pressing problem, a famine, drought, an enemy at the gates, over and over again, their real beliefs are revealed. They don't really believe in God to solve the most important pressing problems. Functionally, the fact that they don't really believe in the living reality of the living God is revealed, and they always do some other thing. This is not to speak particularly negatively about God's people in the Old Testament, because we do this all the time. We're still doing this. We're like, yeah, we're here in church. We believe. Yet this thing came up in my life, and I definitely don't act like it. I act like everybody else. My beliefs are revealed in the way that I act and live in my life. This challenge and conviction of God's people in the Old Testament shows up in many places. Here's one example. In Psalm 78, verses 21 to 22, the text says this: "Therefore, when the Lord heard, he was full of wrath. A fire was kindled against Jacob. His anger rose against Israel because they did not believe in God and trust his saving power." Because they did not believe in God and trust his saving power. So the question of doubt in the life of faith is always on the table for everyone, as long as we're in this physical time. And yet, something additional can happen in an age, in a society, where that layer of doubt is deepened, where the space that it takes up in our lives is expanded, and where its intensity is turned up. And this is arguably what has happened in this time in a secular age, where the conditions of belief in this time, in this place, do not lead you generally to believe in God. In the places where you already struggle with doubt, society doesn't come in and say, hey, you're struggling with those doubts, but generally it's easy societally here to believe in God, because sort of everybody does, and because we have these religious resources or whatever they are, but society actually leans the other way, such that the societal resources that are on offer actually make belief in general feel harder and make doubt feel easier. The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, who I've referenced a handful of times in this sermon series, is a leading thinker in explicating the dynamics that make up secular context. And I've got kind of a long quote here. It'll be the only long quote I'll give you, I promise. But I got a long quote here that we'll look through, where he talks about the way in which all beliefs, not just religious beliefs, but all beliefs in a secular age are fragilized. They're made fragile because of all of the cross currents that are present in this time and all of the competing truth claims. And in such an environment, it's hard for any belief to feel certain, let alone a religious belief. Look at this with me. He says this: almost every action of ours has a point. We're trying to get to work or to find a place to buy a bottle of milk after hours. I have to say, I don't know what reality this guy's living in. I'm not sure if that corresponds to anyone here, but I'm sure that for someone that still is a pressing thing. Even in 2007, with this written up, I've got to get some milk after hours. God help me. Is that anyone's life here? Yeah. Is it really? You're just like at 12:30, like, where can I get some milk? You left the game night. This guy, he's speaking to you. He's speaking to you, Olivia. But we can stop and ask why we're doing these things, and that points us beyond to the significance of these significances, right? The significance of the meaningful things that we're doing in the first place. The issue may arise for us in a crisis where we feel that what has been orienting our life up to now lacks real value or weight. So, for example, a successful doctor, may desert a highly paid and technically demanding position and go off with Doctors Without Borders to Africa with a sense that this is really significant. Do you see what he's saying there? That everyone, not just religious people, are searching for something that feels certain in the realm of meaning, and so we're constantly moving from one thing to the next saying, this is now where I believe real meaning can come in my life. And someone might leave a settled situation because there's this inner gnawing that's happening in their life. The thing that felt true and good and meaningful over here, it's actually very fragile in this time, and so it's been eroded already. And now they go, gosh, I need to go find meaning somewhere else. Can you go to the next slide? A crucial feature of the malaise of imminence is the sense that all these answers are fragile or uncertain. That a moment may come where we no longer feel that our chosen path is compelling or cannot justify it to ourselves or others. There is a fragility of meaning analogous to the existential fragility we always live with, that suddenly an accident, earthquake, flood, a fatal disease, some terrible betrayal may jolt us off the path of our life definitively and without return. This time, because of two major forces. One, the eclipse of transcendence, such that we don't feel like meaning in our lives is rooted in something strong, something that's not going away. We've got to find meaning in our own lives. And secondly, because of all of the different voices that are present in this time, in a pluralistic space where we are engaging with people all the time who are living according to different value systems and different beliefs and different sets of meanings, these two things combined to make all beliefs that we could have in our lives feel fragile and feel temporary, such that that feeling that we long for, the feeling of certainty in what we believe, the feeling of settledness in what we believe, is exceedingly elusive, not just for people of faith, but for everyone. These things combined to make doubt feel par for the course. They combine to make doubt feel par for the course. This can create a serious challenge in religious contexts. Because what if we no longer feel certain about the faith that we felt like we had? What if all of a sudden we're looking at the trajectory of our life and we're going, back here I experienced faith that felt really sure. It almost felt secondhand. I felt really confident sharing it with I found myself sharing it with other people because it felt so settled and certain and confident. And yet now somehow I found myself in a situation where my feeling of certainty is gone. See, I'm keep repeating the word feeling. It's a sense that you just have. And if you've experienced this, you didn't go through an intellectual process where you went, hey, I'm going to question all my faith and blah, 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 and now I'm going to have all these doubts. And that might have come later, but the first thing that happens is you wake up to the reality that your feeling of certainty is gone. You see what I'm saying? There's something inside that you perceive where you go, I really can't explain this. I didn't mean to get here, but this suddenly feels way less certain to me than it did before. And we live in a time that is built to create that experience. Many of us, and certainly this is a path and a journey that many, many people are walking in cities like this in the world today, have had experiences like this in the life of faith. We had some faith in the past, we believed in God, and we got over the part where we couldn't see him. We're like, yeah, I believe in God, and I can't see him, and it doesn't matter because I got this strong faith. But what we didn't realize is that that faith was actually buoyed by a societal context in whatever religious or church context we grew up in that was helping our faith seem certain to us. Because the society that we were in at the time felt that way. The society was built to feel that way. And religious contexts feel like that. We look around, everyone else feels like this is certain, and so I also feel like it's certain. And when the rug gets pulled out from under that, all of a sudden we go, oh my gosh, I didn't realize how much my faith life was leaning on the support of a society that also believed. Now I'm in this other space, and there are all sorts of options on offer, all sorts of belief systems, and even when I come into the community of faith, we're all wrestling and struggling with different doubts and questions that we have. And all of a sudden, my faith feels super fragile. This is all about a change in context. Change in the communal, societal context that we find ourselves in. Many of us have been on this kind of journey. Maybe you're on this kind of journey right now. It can feel really awful. I mean, sometimes religious contexts can see people or engage with people who are struggling with doubt And some of that like religious tone comes in. It's like, don't doubt. How could you doubt? Doubt's bad. It's like, if you've ever struggled with doubt, you probably know that it sucked. It was an awful experience. All of a sudden you wondered, like, can I share this with the community? Are my relationships going to be up for grabs? The thing that made me feel like my life had a purpose and I was orienting my life around, can I actually lean on that anymore? You feel like you're out to sea. You feel like the lights have gone out. You're just groping around in the dark now, whereas previously this certain faith that you had was shining the lights on all of those things. It's a really difficult and painful experience, and I don't have any doubt that some of us are walking through that right now. The loss of this feeling of certainty that we had in faith, but now has been removed and is taken away from us, is very, very jarring. It isn't just jarring, however, it's actually also revealing. It's revealing. Because if we weren't struggling with our faith, in a previous moment in our lives when we felt certain, what really was the substance of our faith back there? You see what I'm asking? If when I felt certain, I didn't have any problem with faith, what was my faith in the first place? Was it in something actually external to myself that I had laid hold of in the name of Jesus and that was eternally life-giving to me? Or was I kind of doing the same thing that everyone's doing and everyone's looking for in the world? A feeling of certainty. Because everyone wants to feel certain. When that is removed, if we're struggling with faith, it actually reveals something about whatever faith we had in the first place. And maybe it wasn't faith at all. Maybe what we had was a feeling of certainty that was linked to a particular society or communal belonging that we were experiencing, and that we weren't really experiencing faith in the first place. Our world is full of doubt, but doubt is a challenge to certainty, not to faith. Our world is full of doubt, but doubt is a challenge and an obstacle to certainty, not to faith. Certainty is an epistemological reality and a sociological reality. Certainty is the sense in my mind that I'm super right about everything. It's an intellectual posture. It's a posture of the mind. I feel certain when I'm just sure that my knowledge is right and couldn't be proved otherwise. Certainty, however, is also a sociological experience. It's the experience of showing up in a group of people and going, I feel comfortable and certain in what I believe because everyone else here thinks the same way. Certainty is both a posture of the mind and it's also a communal sociological experience. But that's not what faith is. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 11. Verses 1 to 3. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for. Things that we hope for are beyond us. They're not currently present. They're future realities, as yet unseen realities that are not currently in the present. And it's the assurance, it's feeling sure, it's feeling conviction about things specifically that we cannot see. As a result, faith is not primarily a sort of posture of the mind of feeling 100% certain about some idea I'm holding. Faith is a mechanism by which we come into reality with something that is unseen. Faith is a mechanism. It's primarily a spiritual mechanism, a spiritual muscle. It's a doorway by which we come into primarily relationship with something that is beyond us as physical beings, with spiritual reality, with the reality of God. Faith is a mechanism by which we lay hold of spiritual reality. This can be confusing for us because, frankly, there's a lot of confusion about faith and faith language and what faith is. Oftentimes, when we talk about faith, we're sort of using it like as a noun, like my faith, right? We're talking about it in the sense of like having a faith content, like a creedal confession or something, or faith is sort of like I've got a faith community. It's like a communal term or something, and so that can be confusing. Also, faith is sort of like come under sustained criticism, right, over the last 20 years. And so people talk about faith and maybe people feel embarrassed. Faith is sort of like some silly thing where people believe in something when all the evidence tells them that they shouldn't, or something like that. And so when we come to the word faith and the idea of faith, we have all these sorts of things that are in our heads that predispose us to think about what faith is. But here, the text of Hebrews is talking about faith as being a mechanism that puts us in touch with a reality. Something that's not primarily about an idea, something that's not primarily about a sociological thing, something that's not primarily about a creedal confession. If faith is those things, it's built on top of this other thing. Faith is a mechanism, a spiritual mechanism, a doorway by which we come into contact with something that we have no other way to come into contact with. Now, when we misunderstand this, there are, a whole bunch of consequences and frustrations to faith and to understanding what faith is and what faith can do. If we misunderstand this and say that faith is sort of this thing that we just use to believe in ideas, just generally, well then sure, faith can become subject to all sorts of kind of cheap intellectual critiques, right? One of the big critiques of faith these days is people come and say, well, that's circular reasoning, right? You believe in something and so it's true because you believe in it, and around and around and around you go, right? And that's just a really common and fairly kind of cheap critique of the life of faith. Because of course that's true about anything, right? That's true about absolutely anything. Yeah, if spiritual reality isn't real, then using faith to step into spiritual reality is viciously circular. If spiritual reality is real, then using faith to step into spiritual reality is the only way you have to engage in spiritual reality. And of course, again, that thought process can be used to undermine anything that people believe in. If it ends up not being true, well, then all your reasoning about it is circular. It applies to everything. Faith, when we misunderstand what it is, can become frustrating because we explain too many things through faith, and it cheapens what faith actually is. Maybe you've experienced this. In oftentimes religious contexts, faith and spirituality can be used to explain absolutely everything that's going on in life. When the reality is that life is made up of a bunch of different causal realms. We have the physical, we have the emotional, we have the mental, we have the relational. And yeah, faith feels cheapened when like I have some chronic problem in my relationships that keeps showing up. Like I keep burning down my friendships. I'm not able to keep any friendships over time. And people just keep going, well, something's going on in faith about that. If only I had more faith. Or maybe there's spiritual warfare around my friendships. Maybe actually what we need is wisdom. To say, if I have chronic problems in my relationships over and over again, maybe I don't need to use faith language to explain that. Maybe I need to say, I need to grow up in my relationships. Right? And we could do that in any number of things. And it's uncompelling, right? When you meet someone of faith who's like, I only explain everything that's going on in my life through the faith category. It's not compelling. It cheapens what faith actually is. Because faith does have a very specific purpose that nothing else can perform. Namely, putting you as a physical creature into spiritual contact with the living God. And yes, sometimes in these other causal areas, faith can be mixed in about them. But like, if something's not going right in our relationships, or it's not going right in my work, or it's not going right in my finances, maybe the first thing that we need is wisdom in those areas, and not just like a vague faith explanation. That actually cheapens our understanding of what real faith actually is. So we should stop doing that. What is faith then? What is faith actually in? What does faith give access to? Faith is a spiritual mechanism that puts us in touch with a reality. Once we get that right, there's all sorts of other things we could say about faith, including, by the way, the intellectual part, right? Including the, how can I reason well about the spiritual reality that I'm in touch with? And that's a very important question to ask, right? I'm not talking about blind faith. I'm not talking about anti-intellectual faith. But at the end of the day, we reason about things in the life of faith in response to what we've encountered spiritually, and then we think reasonably about it. Right? God's not an idea that we're trying to capture in our minds. We don't think about God in the same way that we think about the physical world. We don't scientific method our way to God. We encounter by faith the spiritual reality of God, and then we ask questions about whether or not that encounter is reasonable. Is there evidence for it in the world? Is there archaeological evidence? Is there biblical evidence? Is it philosophically reasonable to think that if there was another spiritual being, they might reach out to me in a particular way? We can do all of those things once we get clear that faith is the mechanism by which we encounter spiritual reality. Now, if we've stopped believing in spiritual reality, then our understanding of faith is going to be pretty truncated. And the reality is that implicitly, in this time, for everyone, inside the church, outside the church, our actual functional belief in spiritual reality is in danger of being almost entirely eclipsed. Right? I mentioned this last week. We are so tempted these days to have a vision of God where we believe in God, but we don't believe in heaven. Somehow God's this idea, but there's no spiritual reality to God. There's no spiritual realm. We believe in God as an idea that undergirds our moral convictions, but we don't believe in the reality of God's Spirit. We believe in a God who gives us an impetus to love other people, but we don't believe in a God who's alive. And if all of these things in our life has been eclipsed, if we're just showing up even in the church and just doing sort of, we have an idea of God that undergirds our morality and away we go, well then actually you don't need faith to do any of that. You don't need faith to open up the Bible and go, hey, the Old Testament law is actually, when you compare it across the world, a really good moral code. There are some questions that we have. We talked about them. How do we, some laws here, don't eat, shirts of 3 different, woven together. Okay, gosh, okay. Don't eat shellfish. All the other examples we talked about. There are things where it's like, contextually, how do these things get updated? Great. That's a whole conversation that we could have, and it's a really relevant conversation. Jesus, by the way, says that not a single stroke of the pen of the law is going to pass away. So even as we wrestle with things that we don't understand, our posture is still shaped by the posture of Jesus, who believed that the Scriptures, every word, mediated the voice of God. That's also up for debate in the church today. Can I have my own posture towards the Scriptures? Or should I maybe have the same posture towards the Scriptures that Jesus had towards the Scriptures? Well, however you answer that question, you're either following yourself and doing sort of a Christian Jesus-y thing with it, or you're following Jesus. So those paths diverge real clearly there. Why was I talking about the Old Testament? Where was I going? I was talking about eating shirts. Yeah, why did I start talking about that? I did too. Thank you. That's it. You can flip open the Bible and go, stacked against all the other moral codes in the world, this is the best. And frankly, I mean, honestly, it is. The Bible is the most concentrated place of all the world's moral wisdom. And when you look at the teachings of Jesus, he says a couple of things that are unmatched by anyone, like love your enemies, like bless those who persecute you and pray for them. Like, no one says that. It doesn't take any faith to do that. It doesn't take any faith to look at that and go, I want to live by a moral code, and now I'm just going to do it. You see what I'm saying? It takes faith to live in relationship to a spiritual reality that you otherwise cannot access. And of course, if you're trying to put faith towards something else, it's going to feel like the wheels are turning and it's not very fun. You're going to feel like you're just spinning your wheels on stuff. Because really your faith life has been boiled down to morality. Or your faith life is boiled down to a community experience. And all those things are good and fine if they're built on the spiritual reality of the living God that you have accessed through faith. If that's at the bottom, everything else stacks in a very life-giving way. But when that's messed up, all of a sudden faith feels challenging and hard. Let's look at something that Paul says about the sort of reality that our faith is geared toward in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 16 to 18. He says this, though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison as we look not to things that are seen, but to things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Leave that up there for a second. How many of the unseen realities that Paul is talking about are actually present in your lived understanding of your life of faith right now? The renewal of your inner self that is corresponding to the wasting away of your outer self, right? The implication being that because your inner self is alive and is being renewed, it is the thing that is going to live beyond death, and that around which your physical body will be reconstituted. How much is that belief actually functionally part of your faith right now? Let's just be honest. For many, many people in spaces like this in churches, that sort of belief is not at all part of people's functional understanding of life. And we see it. We see it in things like we talked about last week. We're all running around just like everyone else in the world is because we feel like we're running out of time. But if we believe that, well, we wouldn't feel like we were running out of time, and we might live differently. The weight of glory that is coming, that is beyond all comparison, that makes us look to things that are unseen. The eternal things that are unseen, that are not transient, that are not governed by time. How many of these sorts of eternal unseen things are actually things that we're accessing in the life of faith? I love this bit in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6. The author goes through, this passage is part of this broader thing called the Hall of Faith. Talks to a lot of faithful people in the Old Testament. He talks through Abel's faith. He looks at Enoch's faith. And after looking at Enoch's faith, he's like, just gives us a little reminder about faith. Verse 6. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists. What kind of a God do you believe in? What kind of God do you believe exists? Do you believe in sort of the religious, Christian-y version of God that's on offer today? The God that's kind of an idea, give you some vague hope for beyond death, it girds your moral convictions, and it provides some sort of religious ritual and community for you to participate in? Or do you believe in the existence of the God that undergirds the reality of all of the things we just looked at in 2 Corinthians chapter 4? Eternal life, life that's unending, the reality and the presence of the Spirit, God's voice speaking into our lives now in present and pressing ways. Do we believe in that God? Because faith puts us into touch with that God. Faith doesn't actually do anything to put us into touch with this other God, this ideal, moralistic, ritual God. When we are in touch with this spiritual reality, we actually then have power to live in the ways that this age and this time wants to live. We looked at this in the sermon series. People want to be good in this time. People derive a huge amount of meaning in their lives from feeling like they're good and like they're living in a good way. And people also want to live a life that's meaningful. And we see in this text two people, Noah and Abraham, who stumbled into those things because they sought it through faith, not because they had goodness or meaning at the center of their target. So, for example, Noah in verse 7, by faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. Noah was faithful to God, and he accidentally became righteous along the way. This verse is quoting from the Old Testament Habakkuk, chapter 2, verse 4, that says this, behold, his soul is puffed up, it is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith. Right? Everyone, in religious context and secular context today, we want to become righteous by living by our own righteousness. We want to say, I'm doing good things and that makes me good. But the Old Testament prophets foresaw a day when we would become righteous, not by trying to be righteous, but by faith getting in touch with the source of life behind righteousness. And one day we would turn around and go, oh my God, I became righteous along the way. That happened to Noah. People want that today. They want to look at their lives and say, I've lived a good life. But you don't get there by having goodness at the center of the target. You get there by having faith in the source of goodness at the center of the target, and then you turn around and go, I became a good person. And once you do that, you of course remove the stink of your own ego from the whole pursuit. People want to live a meaningful life. Abraham, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to a place that he was received as inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. I don't know if people recognize that from the Abraham story in Genesis chapter 12, when God says, go to a land that I will show you. God doesn't tell him where to go. Abraham just starts wandering, and then he gets there, and God goes, you made it. He just went. He just went. How did he do that? By faith, he went to live in the land of promise. Verse 10, for he was looking forward to a city that has its foundations, whose designer is builder is God. Abraham had faith in a reality that was beyond the reality that he was even being called to in the physical. And so he went because his faith put him in touch with the reality of God. And he stumbled along the way into a meaningful life in the physical where God kept all his promises to him. We want these things. But when we put meaning at the center of the target, I've got to do anything I've got to do to make my life feel like it's meaningful. We just feel like all of our efforts are just slipping through our grasp. We put faith at the center of the target, in the source of all meaning, and all of a sudden, bam, life. And we turn around and go, God was so good to me, he kept his promises. I lived a meaningful life. All of these good things come from faith. Now, here's the funny thing. If all of these good things come from faith, and faith only exists in reality, or that's not what I would say, and faith only exists in relationship to the possibility of doubt, then maybe the experience and the reality of doubt has a place in the plans and purposes of God. Have you ever thought about the raw fact that God has allowed doubt to exist in this time? I mean, think about this for a second. Elaine and I were talking about this the other day. In this age and time, God has allowed his reality to be contested. God has allowed his reality to be contested. That's just brute fact. God could have created a world where God's reality was never, for any reason, in doubt. That world is coming. That world is coming. When the obviousness of God's reality is as obvious as the stand, as this chair, as the people who are sitting here, all of the obvious things that you look around and go, it's so obvious. That world is coming. But in this time, God has allowed his existence to be contested. God's allowed the possibility of doubt to exist. And maybe God has done that because he wants people to find him through faith in the first place. Maybe God is creating a world in this time where faith, the only thing that can put you in touch with spiritual reality, is able to exist at all. Maybe it's intentional. God wants faith to exist, and so he's allowed doubt to exist. And if that's true, then living in this space and in this time, in this age, you actually have a unique opportunity to have real faith. Faith that is not just buoyed by a sort of religious community where everything feels easy and certain, but where faith, real faith, that can actually put you in touch with God, grows up out of a place where real doubt can exist. Matthew chapter 13, 45 to 46 says this. Jesus teaches this about the kingdom of heaven. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value, went and sold all that he had and bought it. Now, there's something in this parable about the value, the perceived value of the kingdom. But there's another thing in this parable that is getting at the nature of the kingdom of heaven and God's reality. The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who, on finding one pearl, God has built a kingdom that can be found. And a kingdom that can be found is a kingdom that can be entered. A kingdom that can be entered is a kingdom that is a kingdom of love and freedom, not a kingdom of coercion and brute force. God is building a world of love and freedom and goodness and life, And the only way into this kind of world is for you to find it. And faith is the mechanism by which you find it. That's what God is doing in this time. In order for real faith to exist, we actually need the possibility of doubt to exist. Jesus speaks about faith and doubt all the time. He's talking about faith and doubt all the time. And though Jesus has some hard things to say about doubt, he's not ever trying to just eliminate the possibility of doubt altogether. What he's doing is he's seeing people in their doubt and calling them out of doubt into faith. But where do they start? They start in doubt. And so he says to Peter when he falls in the water, when he tries to walk, he says, why did you doubt? Have faith. He's calling him out of doubt. The man, he wants to heal his child, and the man says, I believe, help my unbelief. Jesus is calling him out of doubt. But doubt is the place that they found themselves in. He's saying, come into faith out of doubt. Even when he says, how long will I have to live with this unbelieving generation? He's saying you have every reason to be called out of doubt into faith. But doubt is still the place where we start. Jesus is calling people out of doubt, not shaming them for experiencing doubt, not trying to just eliminate all doubt altogether. Doubt is a reality of our time. But it is precisely the place where Jesus then reaches in and says, exercise faith and come into relationship with my spiritual reality. Jesus is calling people out of doubt over and over and over again. And that is an opportunity that we have in this time because we experience doubt. We wrestle with doubt. And we live in a time that's going to create situations for doubt over and over and over again. The goal in our experience of that is not to plaster that over with a fake certainty where I go, I never doubt anymore. The goal is to say, when I experience doubt, that is precisely the spot where then I exercise faith and say, God, I have faith. I'm reaching out to you in the name of Jesus. Enter into my life. Enter into my situation. That's actually exactly how that's supposed to work and exactly where we're supposed to live. So you might experience doubt in your own life. You might continue to experience doubts. There are some things that can be done about that. You might have specific questions, that different questions can be answered, information can be brought in. But in this time, we actually live in a time where real faith is actually needed. What if there are many of us sitting here, or many people in the church all over the world today, for whom a whole dimension of faith has never, ever actually had to be expressed? I believed in God, and then I was buoyed by this context. This space creates a context where real faith is needed. And that's what we need to have. We reach out and reach into spiritual reality through faith.